He told a black veteran to take off his honor medal in court, but had no idea who was watching. He didn't speak to make noise, he spoke when it mattered. Charles Chuck Delaney was one of those men. You didn't have to know his record to feel it in the way he walked, the way he stood. At 68 years old, with a spine straight as a bayonet and eyes that had seen 2 wars, Chuck didn't wear his medals to impress anyone. He wore them for the fallen. And today, he wore them for Lamar Jenkins, a young Marine who had lost both his legs in Syria, now being denied the benefits he bled for. Chuck stood silently in that courtroom, not at the center of the case, but in solidarity. His uniform was outdated but clean. His distinguished service cross caught the overhead light like a flame. Then Judge Ronald Bishop looked up. "Remove that decoration," he said, flat as stone. The courtroom froze. Chuck didn't flinch. "It's not decoration," he replied. "It's earned." But the judge's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp and full of quiet contempt. "This is a courtroom, not a costume party," he snapped. And in that moment, something in the air changed. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. Chuck looked over at Lamar, sitting in his wheelchair, eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm wearing this for him," Chuck said, "and for the ones who never made it home." The judge didn't care. "This is my courtroom," Bishop growled. "I don't need war stories." And just like that, the threat of contempt hung in the air. But Chuck wasn't the only one recording what happened next. The courtroom murmurs stopped cold. No one dared move. Judge Bishop leaned forward, eyes fixed on Chuck like he was a trespasser, not a hero. "One more word," the judge warned, "and you'll spend the night in jail." Chuck didn't reply. He simply removed the medal, not from shame, but from strategy. Because he wasn't there just to support Lamar. He was there to expose a pattern. What Judge Bishop didn't know was that over the past year, Chuck had quietly helped compile evidence, transcripts, statements, recordings, all pointing to a troubling trend. Veterans of color being denied at higher rates. Their trauma questioned, their service minimized. And Bishop's courtroom? At the center of it all. Chuck sat back down, hands folded, medal on the bench beside him. Not defeated, just waiting. And the judge, emboldened by what he thought was submission, went further. "You people and your medals," Bishop muttered under his breath. "Always playing the victim." Lamar's head snapped up. So did the courtroom reporters. A man in the back adjusted his glasses. One of the journalists Chuck had quietly tipped off. That single sentence, barely above a whisper, had been caught on 3 separate devices. And Bishop wasn't finished. "This case is another waste of taxpayer money," he said loudly. "If we handed out checks to every soldier with a sob story, we'd go bankrupt." Gasps rippled through the room. Chuck's face didn't move, but inside, he knew the trap had been sprung. Because this wasn't about disrespect anymore. This was about exposure. And by the time court adjourned, the judge had no idea his words were already on their way to a national newsroom. The footage hit the newsroom before sundown. 3 angles, clear audio, and one undeniable truth. A sitting judge had humiliated a decorated black veteran in open court, not just with words, but with contempt laced in bias. The news anchor's voice trembled with barely contained outrage. The clip was short, just under 3 minutes, but it spread like wildfire. Twitter, TikTok, Facebook groups for veterans, activist circles, legal watchdogs. Within 6 hours, hashtags exploded. Hashtag honor not hate, hashtag justice for Chuck, hashtag Bishop exposed. Chuck watched it unfold quietly from his small kitchen, sipping coffee like nothing had changed. Lamar sat beside him, stunned. "You really set this up?" he asked. Chuck nodded. They needed to see it for themselves. By morning, the governor's office was fielding calls. Veterans organizations demanded action. An online petition calling for Bishop's removal crossed 100,000 signatures by lunchtime. But what the public didn't know yet, and what Chuck was preparing to release next, was even more damning. Behind the courtroom scenes, Chuck had helped collect over 50 cases, veterans of color whose claims had been denied by Bishop, claims dismissed with identical language. Phrases like not credible, emotional exaggeration, no visible impairment, all while white veterans with similar or lesser injuries were approved without issue. The media hadn't seen that yet, but they would, because Chuck had saved everything: emails, rulings, testimonies, and one chilling voicemail from a court clerk. He calls them angry soldiers, says they're just looking for handouts. This wasn't just a moment of disrespect. It was a system, and Chuck was about to bring the whole thing down. Judge Bishop showed up to court the next morning like nothing happened. Crisp black robe, smug confidence, not a flicker of concern in his face. But the courtroom was different now. There were cameras outside, protesters holding up pictures of Chuck in uniform, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, and sitting in the back row, the same journalist who'd aired the first clip, now with a press badge clearly visible on her chest. Chuck didn't return that day. He didn't have to. The footage had done its job, and overnight, something shifted. A whistleblower from the clerk's office stepped forward anonymously, confirming what many feared. Judge Bishop had a nickname for claims filed by black veterans, the sympathy stack. That detail hit harder than any footage, because it wasn't just bias, it was routine. Chuck's files, organized, time-stamped, cross-referenced, were now in the hands of two investigative reporters. Lamar's case was the tip of the spear. Beneath it were cases involving amputations, combat trauma, burn pits, PTSD, all dismissed with the same cold rubber stamp from Bishop's bench. And still, the judge remained arrogant. He went on conservative radio, calling the backlash a woke ambush, and claiming Chuck was a disgruntled old soldier looking for attention. That was his final mistake. Because that night, a new clip aired, one the public hadn't seen. It was from a sealed session 3 months earlier. Bishop, caught off guard during a private hearing, had laughed while denying benefits to a veteran with severe facial burns. If he didn't want to look like that, the judge said, he shouldn't have played hero. There was no coming back from that. The next morning, Bishop was escorted from the courthouse by federal agents. The news spread faster than the damage could be controlled. Judge Ronald Bishop, 30 years on the bench, a name once feared in civil courts, now reduced to a viral villain. Headlines weren't polite. The judge who mocked heroes. Veterans betrayed by the bench. Chuck didn't gloat. That wasn't his nature. Instead, he met with the legal team handling the civil rights investigation, handing over his final document, a spreadsheet tracking denial rates by race and injury type, covering 7 years of rulings. The numbers were staggering. Black and Latino veterans were denied benefits by Bishop at over 3 times the rate of white veterans. PTSD claims were routinely dismissed with phrases like subjective, unreliable, or unstable temperament. But Chuck had done more than collect the data. He had connected it to real people. Names, faces, families. One of them, a Navy corpsman named Miguel Rojas, broke down during an interview. "He told me my trauma was a personality flaw," Miguel said. "Like getting shot was my fault." That soundbite aired nationally. And then came the call. Congressional leaders wanted Chuck in D.C., not as a witness, but as an advisor. His calm, methodical dismantling of a racist system was too effective to ignore. He wasn't just exposing corruption. He was showing how to fix it. Meanwhile, Bishop's attorney tried damage control, claimed his client had a tough courtroom manner, and was being unfairly judged by a digital mob. But the footage didn't lie. Neither did the data, and neither did the growing list of veterans ready to testify. What began as a cold insult in a courtroom had now turned into a national reckoning. And Chuck? He was just getting started. Chuck arrived in Washington wearing the same uniform Judge Bishop once mocked. This time, no one dared call it a costume. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Chuck walked silently, flanked by veterans, black, brown, white, young, old, a living testimony to the fight he had brought to the nation's front door. Inside the hearing room, lawmakers sat straight-backed. This wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about the system that let him thrive. Chuck's opening statement was only 12 minutes long, but it landed like a gavel. He spoke not with fury, but with precision, naming names, referencing cases, highlighting the coded language used to discredit black veterans. He read Bishop's words aloud. These men bring their behavior problems into the courtroom and expect sympathy. The room went silent. One senator wiped tears from her eyes. Another stared at the floor. But Chuck wasn't finished. He called for a federal audit of all veteran benefit denials issued in the past 20 years, starting with Bishop's bench, but not ending there. It's not just about removing a bad actor, he said. It's about rebuilding the system he represented. And then he paused. For every vet who walked into a courtroom hoping for justice and walked out feeling ashamed, this is for them. The room erupted in applause, rare in a hearing, but no one stopped it. Back home, Lamar watched from his hospital bed. A nurse whispered, "That's your guy, isn't it?" Lamar just nodded, tears in his eyes. What neither of them knew yet was that Bishop had just received notice of another investigation, not civil, but criminal. The criminal investigation moved swiftly, faster than anyone expected. Prosecutors had quietly reviewed not just Bishop's rulings, but his financials. That's when things turned from unethical to illegal. Several denials he'd issued lined up almost perfectly with donation dates from private insurance companies, entities that profited every time a veteran's claim was denied. It wasn't just bias anymore, it was bribery. Quiet, indirect, but traceable. A shell nonprofit, a consulting fee to a relative. Small numbers on paper, but huge consequences in the courtroom. When confronted, Bishop did what bullies do when cornered. He deflected, raged, claimed victimhood. He blamed political correctness. He blamed veterans for gaming the system. But none of it stuck. Not when Chuck's documentation kept matching up. Not when testimonies poured in from across the country, all echoing the same pattern of cruelty, of dismissal, of deep racial resentment cloaked in procedure. News outlets released a second wave of stories. Former clerks came forward. One described how Bishop would red pen claims with sarcastic notes like, "Here we go again, another trauma sob story." Another revealed that he instructed staff to scrub sympathy from veteran claims, calling it emotional theater. Meanwhile, Chuck kept quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because the story was speaking for itself now. Justice was finally louder than the silence. And then the final blow came. The federal court unsealed a private memo, an official complaint filed in 2011 against Bishop, buried, ignored, and never followed up on. It described almost everything Chuck had proven. They had known. They just hadn't acted. Until now. The unsealed memo hit harder than expected, not because it was shocking, but because it proved everyone had looked away. The 2011 complaint, filed by a former JAG officer and fellow veteran, had detailed Bishop's racial double standards in painstaking detail. Black veterans are routinely dismissed or discredited, it read. He refers to them as manipulative, overly emotional, or attention-seeking. This is a pattern, not an opinion. That memo was buried. No follow-up, no disciplinary action. Just silence. Now that silence was deafening. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs called a press conference. For the first time, the department admitted systemic failure, not just in Bishop's courtroom, but across the bureaucracy. A task force was announced, and at the head of it, Charles Chuck Delaney. He didn't ask for the role. He didn't want the spotlight. But he accepted, because the work wasn't finished. Because for every Lamar Jenkins who eventually got his benefits, there were dozens who never did. Some who didn't survive long enough to fight back. Chuck's first move was immediate. Reopen every single case Judge Bishop had presided over in the last 10 years. Hundreds of files, each one a life, a struggle, a story. Teams of lawyers and advocates were assigned, and Chuck, the same man who once stood silently in a courtroom as he was humiliated, now led them. Meanwhile, Bishop's world shrank. Sponsors vanished. Speaking gigs canceled. His house was picketed by veterans. His former allies fell silent, or worse, denied they'd ever supported him. And then, for the first time in 3 weeks, Bishop made a public statement. A weak apology, written by lawyers. Flat, hollow. Chuck didn't respond, because real justice was no longer a conversation. It was a reckoning. Months passed, but the fire never dimmed. What started as a single courtroom insult had become a nationwide reform movement. Chuck's task force uncovered more than just one bad judge. They found patterns baked into the system: outdated review processes, biased language templates, and internal culture that treated veterans of color like they were exaggerating their wounds. With every file reopened, new stories emerged. Men and women who had given everything, only to be told their suffering didn't meet the standard. But now, those stories were being heard. Lamar Jenkins was among the first to receive full retroactive benefits, not just medical care, but acknowledgement, a formal apology from the Department of Defense. He cried as he read it, the weight of years lifting off his shoulders. Chuck stood beside him that day, saying nothing, just a hand on Lamar's shoulder, steady and proud. The media kept circling back to Bishop, but Chuck stayed focused. This was never just about him, he told a reporter. It's about what allowed him. Still, Bishop's name stayed in the headlines, especially when the Justice Department officially filed criminal charges, obstruction, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. His mugshot appeared on every screen in the country. The robe was gone. The arrogance, too. And in a twist no one expected, one of the whistleblowers who had helped Chuck quietly turned out to be a former Marine denied by Bishop 10 years ago. He had buried his case, changed careers, and became a court clerk just to get close enough to expose what happened. I knew someone would come along to finish it, he said. Turns out it was Sergeant Chuck. And the best part? Chuck wasn't finished yet. 1 year later, the courtroom where Judge Bishop once presided was renamed the Veterans Justice Hall. A bronze plaque now stands near the entrance, not with Bishop's name, but with a quote from Chuck: "Justice isn't given to veterans. It's owed." Inside, portraits of decorated soldiers from all backgrounds now line the walls, a deliberate reminder of who this system exists to serve. Chuck never asked for the spotlight, but the country gave it to him anyway. He was invited to speak before Congress, not once, but 3 times. He helped write new legislation that required implicit bias training for all judges hearing veteran cases and mandated independent reviews for denied claims involving PTSD and combat injuries. A sweeping reform package now bears his name, the Delaney Bill. But Chuck, true to form, quietly retired from public life once the work was set in motion. He returned home, back to the modest house with the worn porch and fading flag, the one Bishop once looked down on. He still wears the same uniform on Memorial Day, still visits the graves of men he fought beside, still refuses to call himself a hero. Lamar visits often, so do others. Veterans who once felt invisible now see themselves in Chuck, not as broken, but as brave. As for Bishop, he pled guilty to obstruction and civil rights violations in exchange for a reduced sentence. No robe, no retirement ceremony, no legacy. Just a disgraced man behind a courtroom door he used to control, now locked from the outside. And every time someone walks past that bronze plaque, they stop. They read. They remember. Because one man stood up in silence, and the whole country finally listened. If that ending gave you chills, share this. More people need to know what quiet dignity can truly destroy.